performance, and a worsening food insecurity situation. Soaring inflation has therefore taken place with no abating signs. However, opportunities for growth, investment, and poverty reduction are still existing for South America. This region has a historical chance to take advantage of the current geopolitical turmoil. Raising commodity prices and diversifying exports could eventually pay enormous dividends. How is a potentially consolidated South America perceived, despite power asymmetries between its member states? Will existing trade agreements forge the path to a unified region with sufficient capabilities to fight the crisis? What are the odds of Latin America replacing Russia's role as a major raw material exporter? What effects on the wider Atlantic?
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage our moderator for this session, East and Central Africa Bureau Chief at Financial Times, Mr. Andris Kipani.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for being here, and welcome to the final plenary session of the 11th edition of the Atlantic Dialogues in search of a consolidated Latin America. I am Andres Kipani. I am the East and Central Africa Bureau Chief with the Financial Times, but I used to cover Latin America for over a decade, and I am originally from Argentina, and I will be the moderator for this panel with four former Latin American presidents, Ramón Puerta of Argentina, Jorge Quiroga of Bolivia, and Jamil Mahuad of Ecuador. Gracias. Apologies in advance, as this is a male-only panel, so I will open the floor to questions on the very last, at the end of the session, so we can make it as diverse as possible. The panel will be in Spanish, so if you need it, please use the headphones that you have on your seats. Over the past few days, we have heard about a raging war in Eastern Europe, a food crisis in the Horn of Africa, street power in many parts of the world, and suffered through 2 World Cup games here. But the big question is, where is and was Latin America in all this? Voy a empezar con la misma pregunta para todos.
I have the same question for all of you. Given the current international tumultuous context, where is Latin America? And as we were saying earlier, if we look at this from a micro and a macro perspective, what can Latin America do so as to play a role in what is happening today? Thank you. I'd like to start by telling you a story. Almost 20 years ago, Ecuador exported shrimp, and we had more than $600 million in exportation. We had a disease problem, which is called white spot. Today, we are able to overcome that, and we now export much more. We export 7 billion tons, or $7 billion. In fact, it has become our major export. So, in fact, what we've been eating here at the buffet probably comes from Ecuador. Yes, it probably comes from Ecuador. How were we able to increase our imports this way? First of all, we had to look at our resources. For climate reasons, for geographical reasons, we're a major shrimp producer. And then we had a major businessman who came along, Mr. Eduardo Salem. He was very observant, but he also saw things that no one else saw. The shrimp from this one specific place, most of them died, and very few were left alive. So we worked using many worked, in fact, using antibiotics to keep the 90 that died alive. He looked at things differently. He said, why is it that 10% remain alive? Why is it 10% can live with the pathogen? So he worked, in fact, on increasing production of the 10% that survived, so that he could continue production without antibiotics. So there was, in fact, a change in the paradigm, a new way of analyzing the problem. And here is where we can tie into the ideas in this forum. How to cooperate in a changing world and how to use dialogue. President Quiroga referred to how the world is changing, and this is what we're supposed to be talking about. The reason I started with this story is linked to what a panelist said. He is Hansab Jaham from Morocco, and he explained how you are using here Morocco's satellite to determine the amount of humidity in the trees, and he also explained how drones are used to deliver the right amount of fertilizers where needed, instead of using large machinery to do widespread broadcast of fertilizing. So with drones, you can cover a lot more terrain more efficiently than you can with a tractor. I'm listened to what this person from Morocco was saying, listening to these new ideas. And I said, we're doing more or less the same thing in my part of the world with shrimp. This is how we can connect. This is how countries of the South, small countries that need to integrate into this changing world, can work together. We had the creation of a famous cluster, the private sector cluster. These are businessmen who took risks, who had initiatives, who opened laboratories to examine the diseases, who opened up markets, who found new ways to commercialize his products, new ways to transport them. And the public sector, instead of competing, arguing with the private sector, the public sector came up with two basic policies. First of all, interfere as little as possible. And secondly, we adopted a decision that created some polemics. We adopted the US dollar as the national currency. That enabled us to lower inflation considerably. From 2 digits to 1 digit. We have 4% inflation in my country. We have the highest vital wages in all of Latin America. 22 years later, Morocco, are able, 22 years later, we are able to measure just how good this policy was. We have the private sector, academia, working together, and a public policy strategy that keeps up to date. We need public policy to be technically fit, socially acceptable. The population has to accept to live with that policy and not go against it. And also, it has to be a viable policy, which means it needs a level of support that enables it to prosper, to be applied. So what can we do, our countries do, to benefit from changes? I'd like to add something that also is in line with some of the things that have been said here in Marrakesh. In Ecuador, there was a huge debate on who did the Ecuadorian Amazon belonged to. There where we had oil. There was a whole debate on title rights, etc. And one member of an indigenous community, native from that land, was interviewed by the media, and he was asked, "Who do you think Amazonia belongs to?" And he gave, I think, the best thought-out answer that one could imagine. He said, "I can't answer that question because you're asking, who does the Amazon belong to? We are convinced that we belong to Amazonia." How can you work with nature, cooperate with nature, get rid of that warrior language we had before? You had to conquer the Amazon and go into a mindset where you work with the Amazon. We're going to come back to this a bit later on. Who is the main importer of your shrimp? Well, China. About 60% of our exports, it goes to China. 36% of total your exports go to China, and only 26% are imported by the United States. This is the opposite of what was going on before. This is a quantitative change, but also a qualitative change. We're in a complete paradigm shift. And many of us don't even realize that the rules are changing, the players are changing, context is in constant transformation. And now that you've got the roll rolling, if I remember correctly, the United States would say you have to choose a side. You're with us or you're with the Russian. On whose side is Latin America today? With China, with the Russians, with the U.S. We're now in Africa, where China has a lot of influence through investment in recent years. How do you see China? How do you see this dichotomy? Where is Latin America going? Closer to China, closer to the U.S., closer to Russia? Well, thank you, Andres, Jamil, and Ramon. Thank you very much for inviting us. And this is really a great timing, right for the semifinals of the World Cup. In order to reach Africa, you have to travel through the north. And I was told that we weren't sure we were going to be able to get in because everything was very much controlled by Mr. Bono. Well, let's talk a little bit about China and a little bit about the forum. My perspective on Latin America and China, Russia, and even COVID, the three S's. With respect to China, when I hear North Americans or Europeans saying, be careful, be wary of China, by way, no way. In Latin America, from the Panama Canal to the south, we're all Chinese. Why? Because we all produce the materials that China is buying and increasing prices and increasing volumes. Petroleum, gas, silver, zinc, coffee, milk, beef, lithium. And one of the best examples of this would be today you have two presidents who are working incessantly to establish a free trade agreement with China, Lasso and Lacalle Pou. And I don't think that they would be called socialists or communists. They're looking to their pocket. And unfortunately, the United States is out, and Europe is also closed. And that's the reality of our relationship with China. But just one thing is China as a buyer of what we make, and another thing is China as an investor and the environmental laws. And then we have China that loans money and who insists on being paid back down to the last cent. And we are champion of reducing our external debt. And we've done this continuously. We've condemned multilateral aid, and now China is our creditor, and this is the challenge we're going to have to meet. I have a quick comment on the virus. We've had 3 times more deaths than in the region. In fact, it's because we've had a precarious health system, also have young people. What really bothered me is that one thing the P5 could have done and the Security Council could have done would have reached a consensus with respect to the vaccine. But they didn't. Vaccines, well, the Chinese had vaccines, the Russians had vaccines, the European had vaccines. Why couldn't we do something? Why couldn't we join our hands in manufacturing vaccines? But Brazil, Mexico, and Argentina do have vaccine production capacity, yes, to make them and to distribute them, but we missed out on that opportunity. As for Russia, yes, we have the possibility to sell minerals and food to Russia, and we've been doing that for some time. We did that with China, and now with the opportunity with Russia. What is my concern here? As I am a fervent Democrat, and I call for Latin America respecting democracy, having free elections, respecting constitutions, I don't call on Azerbaijan to respect this, or Qatar. No, I'm asking Latin America. We signed our Charter for the Protection of Democracy after 9/11. I'm calling for the region to respect this charter. But I think that this dichotomy that you're trying to create in the United States and in Europe, China one side, Russia on the other, just doesn't apply elsewhere. You could ask a question, does Russia have the right to annex land that doesn't belong to Russia? No. We've suffered from that. You ask Mexico, do they want to lose Baja California, for example? No. I think that Ukraine's triumph will save Latin American countries who are suffering from pressures, who are occupied by Russia and Iran. This is the case with Venezuela. If Zelensky wins, that will help out more Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba than anybody else. This is, in fact, something that we are very attentive to in the region. And then we have the 3 S's cycle, which generate a lot of instability. That's food, fuel, and security. When you look at what's going on throughout the world, increasing of inflation, increasing interest rates, devaluations, external debts that's drowning us, that's what we're going to have to deal with. The price of food is increasing. The price of fuel is increasing. The only institution that works in this world with lightning speed is the Federal Reserve. They turned on the vacuum cleaner. They're getting rid of liquidity, and this is affecting the exchange rates in Latin America. The world has to determine what they can do to provide credit to countries with a small percentage of what is being spent in Ukraine. Now we could capitalize the Latin American Bank, the African Bank, that will provide liquidity when it is most needed. And finally, we have governance in the region, or governability in the region. We've been talking about a pink tide in Latin America. There is a enormous desire for change from Colombia to Brazil. We've had 18 elections where the outsider has won. The incumbent loses. And the more radical the outsider, the more likelihood that he will win. Of course, there was a predominance of governments of the center-left, which have led to the situation we find ourselves in. We could talk about what will be happening in Argentina and Mexico later on to see if this trend doesn't continue. The problems with governance in Latin America, we do have problems. We have Peru. A democracy doesn't mean that you will have competent governments, and we have ample examples for that. What we need to maintain is our free and open elections, and we have to fight to maintain those. And my concern is that when we signed our democratic charter that provided parameters for governance, there was one exception. There was Cuba. Now there are three: Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua. And my greatest fear is that at the rate that we're going to become a hybrid zone. If there's something that we had in common with Europe is that we were a democratic hub. And what we need to do is make sure that we cover democracy, freedom, and the rule of law in the continent. We need to recover Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba, who have as much right to freedom as anyone else. Ramon Jamil has told us that Ecuador has a 4% inflation, virtually no external debt. Argentina is quite in the opposite position. What are the root causes of some of these problems? We have a change in the governor of the Inter-American Development Bank. Perhaps that will change. Let's talk about China. You still need financing. Latin America doesn't have that capacity. What options do you have? How can you make this financing governable, macroeconomically and politically, so that other countries don't descend into what happened in Nicaragua, for example? Well, three things, and that to touch upon what has already been said. First of all, I'm going to talk to you about convertibility. Convertibility just didn't work for us. We had it affected liquidity enormously. We had Domingo Cavallo, a great friend of ours, decided we didn't need flexibility. Brazil is a great friend of Argentina, did it in '98, and Argentina continue with a 1-to-1 conversion rate, and all of this didn't work. We lost flexibility. And then we had a devaluation at 40% in 2002. So today, the dollar, where you had $1 to 1 peso, is now $1 to 350 peso. And this is we have 100% in annual growth in the inflation rate. We're really on the wrong path here. And then we had the major problem that arose, and that has already been mentioned, are democratic issues. Democracy, which is either the best of systems or the least bad, has no alternative. Everything else is not democratic. What we have to do, make sure that democracy works. And for that, we need two key elements. We need a political parties. You cannot have a democracy without intermediaries. You need politicians. But you can't have 300 political parties either, because then every little small boss will put together a little political party and say they're defending democracy. That system will not function. And this is what we see in various countries in our continent. Unfortunately, that's true for my country. So for democracy to work, we need to make sure that political parties work. Those democracies that work in the world have 2 or 3 parties, not more. And we're losing this in our continent. And why? Because the world of politics is suffering from a poor image. It's a dirty word. Politicians are seen as very negatively. Look at what's happening in Peru. So not only do you have the failures of politicians running the country, but the entire system is suffering from failure. What can you do to rebuild the reputation of a political system that is needed to get democracy to work? And I don't see that there's a single country in this world that protects freedom, that protects democracy, and gives primacy to an economic model. Look what happened with the Berlin Wall. You need to have a model that responds to what the people are asking for. We need to have fiscal balance. You have to have trade capacity. In the 90s, my country had that. Today, we have a huge fiscal deficit. We went when we started using a model more similar to Venezuela, increasingly so, the expenses went from 7% to 27%. We export soybeans because our soil is very fertile. We can do this without water, without fertilizers, because the land is just wonderful, and also because we have a development model that is linked to the Spanish vision of things. Jesuits, in fact, started with a very primitive system and developed a system that turned out to be in the vanguard. We lost our efficiency, and we did that because of public spending and demagogues. This is why we have an enormous amount of our population in poverty. We need to be able to use an economic model that is valid, that is aligned with the times. And a lot of what's happening in this world, to the world of politics, is linked to the fact that the corruption in political spheres is not punished. And it just sets an example for someone else. 20 years ago, when a municipal or councilman bought a new automobile, somebody asked him, where did you get the money to buy a new car? And if he couldn't provide a clear answer, he sometimes had to leave his post and sometimes even had to leave town. Today, when people buy a luxury home or a luxury car, he has a visit from one of his neighbors who wants to know how he can get the same. We have a value crisis. Corruption is something that we see in countries, and I'm talking about the United States or Europe, where you have political leaders being bought. And we see that there are about 2 or 3 powers in this world conducting these activities. What I want are rules that punish countries, not only for the crimes they commit in a given country, but also are punished in the countries where they have headquarters, because they are putting in danger our democratic world. And this is one idea that I wanted to present in response to some of the ideas, very important ideas that we've heard about. We've talked about the trade surplus. One of the key themes that we've talked about these last 3 days are the exacerbated food crisis because of the war in Ukraine, because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Your countries produce basic commodities, food and energy. What role could Latin America play in the world with respect to food and energy, and how? So from the micro to the macro. As for the concerns of governability and China, in the case of governability, between up to 2002 and 5 years before that, 9 presidents in Latin America were unable to complete their mandate. Presidents that had been democratically elected. We had 2 presidents in Bolivia, 1 in Argentina, 1 in Peru, 1 in Paraguay, 1 in Venezuela. Chavez, he was able to come back, however. And we generous Ecuadorians had 3 presidents who weren't able to complete their mandate. I was one of them. So if you're a doctor and you see that 5 presidents in 5 years in a region where there are 11 countries are unable to complete their mandate, you would reach the conclusion that there is a pandemic. There's something in the water. There's something in the air causing a problem. Some of these presidents were from the left, the center, and the right. There were presidents who were outsiders or who were being reelected. Some were middle-aged, older, younger. Presidents who had undertaken major economic reform and paid for it. Some of them were in the middle of their reform. Presidents who had yet to start their reform. And that from the very north to the very south of the continent. So what was the common factor? The only common denominator was a brutal economic crisis. Karl Marx and James Cargill, the American political analyst, remember what he said during Clinton's campaign? It's the economy, stupid. The economy affects people's lives enormously, and this is why we have all of these perturbations. Later on, there was only one government that had a president who wasn't able to complete his mandate. What happened? Well, there was on the radar, we had China appear. And they were able to buy everything we produce at very good prices. So we had increases in exports. The economy improved. The population was happier. Governments became stable with the same parties, with the same ideology. What changed everything? The economy. So what's happening now? I don't want to get involved in this debate. Is China going to be or not be the world's economic power? Clearly, they're number 2, and they're rising. And since they're number 2, for us in Latin America, they've become our primary trading partner. The trade deficit with China is less than 1% of our GDP as the region, and that's a lot. And I don't know if you're aware of this, but if China does become the world's economic power for the first time in more than 200 years, we will have, as a major player, a government that is not Western, that is not Christian, and is not democratic. And if those 3 things don't make the very foundations that we are used to standing on shake, if we don't realize that this is an earthquake heading towards us, and we're not aware of what's going on in the world. That's what I can say about what I've just heard. Latin America can be governable. A lot depends on the economy, and we have to be very attentive to China's role in the future. We have this marvelous map of South America behind us, and as you know, with the exception of the coastal ranges, of coastal areas, we don't have a water problem. However, 1% of the world's water is fresh water, and 30 to 40% of the water that we use for agriculture is lost. If we concentrate our efforts in lowering waste, we will be able to accomplish a lot towards improving the planet's well-being. And we can do the same with food. 40% of food production in the world doesn't get to the mouths of human beings. 40%. 40% is lost in production, in harvest, in transportation. We can improve that situation enormously. And this is where something fundamental arises. The famous good-through dates on food. There is a lot of research in the world that has proven that you can open a tin of food that is no longer good for a year, and it would still be edible. I think we need to review our rules concerning good-through dates so that supermarkets don't have to throw away food. We have to think about that when there are 800 million people throughout the world that go to bed hungry. And to close with something positive, in various parts of the world, we have food banks that are opening up that pick up on these products, and instead of throwing them to the trash can, they circulate them. We have chefs throughout the world who use this food that is no longer considered edible because of the good-through date and use it to make dishes. Now we have ugly food. It's those products who don't look pretty, who don't pretty enough to be sold, or don't have the right shape, not very uniform, who don't have what we're used to seeing in supermarkets. And I think by working at trying to sell that ugly food, we could improve conditions for everyone. So a lot could be done by reducing waste.
Tenemos dos de los más grandes productores de comida en América Latina, Brasil y Argentina. ¿Se puede alimentar el mundo?
Tenemos enormes oportunidades y que van a seguir creciendo. Creo que un problema que tenemos en la región es que tenemos mecanismos de integración regional donde llenamos toda la ensalada de alfabeto que uno se puede imaginar, los andinos, el Mercosur, el Grupo de Río, el Foro Iberoamericano, con los españoles y sin los gringos, con los gringos sin los españoles, sin ninguno de los dos, el sistema centroamericano, el caribeño. Somos campeones mundiales para reinventarnos mecanismos donde nos reunimos a conversar, a diferencia de Europa, que tiene uno solo, que con problemas funciona. Y eso que ustedes en Europa, los que están acá, hablan idiomas diferentes, de repente rezan a dioses diferentes, se pelean en el fútbol, tuvieron guerras, pero en América Latina no somos capaces de integrarnos. La única integración sudamericana efectiva que funciona es en las delanteras de los equipos de fútbol de Europa. Ahí solamente juegan argentinos, brasileños, chilenos, uruguayos, Suárez, Messi, Neymar, ahí juegan bien, pero en el lado nuestro no. Y eso te crea dificultades para aprovechar este momento. Y no veo, por la tendencia que se viene de devaluaciones, donde vamos a empezar a...
I do not see why this is happening. Imagine in Ecuador, they use the dollar, and now Colombia is around 5,000 pesos per dollar. now Argentina and Brazil. These creates the kind of tensions that make it impossible to have a regional framework in place to expand ourselves and to grow. And we also have friends in Latin America and in the US, which are making it difficult for us to make progress. And then we are told we shouldn't be speaking to the Chinese, for instance. And when it comes to food and energy, I'd like to mention two things. The world that will grow the most from across the globe is Guyana. If you want to be happy and have a growth rate per capita like no other, then go to Guyana. They have a huge potential over there. And then, if we look at the map behind us, from Bolivia to Argentina and Chile, according to certain studies, we have around from two-thirds to three-fourths of the planet's lithium. It seems that Mexico also has a fair share of it. This means that the digitalized economy, where our watches, our mobile telephones, our iPads, all our devices are using lithium batteries. This means that lithium will continue to be essential. The challenge is not to sell lithium carbonate to the Chinese so that the batteries are made over there and then sent back to us, or are we going to be able to exploit this huge potential in lithium? And then two very quick notes related to this. Climate change is real. It is here. We can see it everywhere. And as the film said, follow the money, and then follow the money. My country is stuck away, and we still don't have that difficulty. But if the waters continue to rise, we will continue to have a sea in Bolivia because, well, Jorge, this might be a strategy. Who knows? Rivers, water, and water courses, when we have floods, when we have storms, you know what happens. In these mountains you see here, I go up them once a year. The first time I went to the top of the Limani, the snow line was at a given level, and when I went there last year, the snow line was 200 meters over than what it was a few years ago. And this is not to do with the actual nature of the mountains, but is the actual lack of water. This is real. We are affected by it, and as a region we need to enter this discussion because we have good sun, we have good wind, we have lithium, gas, because gas has half carbon emissions as other energy sources. And there are many opportunities that we have as a region. And now, very quickly, something about Peru, which is in everybody's agenda. Yes, Peru changes presidents as one would change their shirt. But if there is something to highlight about Peru is the good judiciary system they have. It is sad to say this, but from Fujimori in 2000 to Toledo in 2001, Alan Garcia 2011, Kuczynski 2016, and now with Castillo, it is sad, but all elected presidents are either in prison or somewhere else, or they have suicide, they have committed suicide, and the whole corruption across Africa and Latin America, the only place where there were punishments applied was Peru. Although the changes in the policies, etc., this has remained stable. And another lesson from Peru. I remember German foundations, they brought this municipality-based system of constructive structures. After a year, the team of the mayor comes together and they can change the mayor. And this actually took us to a situation where we started changing mayors. Very often we have a fixed mandate presidential systems, and somebody came up with the idea that the prime minister and the president can close the Congress if they lose any motion. And well, this is the system. French system, as applied in Peru, and this does not give as a result Peugeot or Airbus, etc. This is the systemic system in short. And let me conclude with an idea. Since we are here in Morocco, I actually congratulate myself on having this type of fora, because what we are really needing is spaces where the civil society, emerging leaders, men and women, can sit around and discuss and push our governments to cooperate. We have such spaces in the Pacific. I travel to Asia a lot more than to the US these days. I belong to different boards and bodies and institutions, but in the Atlantic world, it seems that we can only meet with either the North Americans or with the Europeans. And it's the same thing when it comes to traveling. And to have a Zoom conversation, the optical fiber goes from the US to London and back to Latin America. And here we're talking about industrial things, containers, flights, ships, digital lines, things that are not developed regionally. And if we are waiting for our leaders to do something about it, then that solution will never come. We need to make the most of this opportunity to reinforce the Atlantic ties. And please use Morocco. This event next year will raise five times more interest, thanks to what the Moroccan team have achieved. This is a fantastic promotion, national promotion. What Morocco did was a national promotion exercise that's absolutely unique. So do make the most of it. Do invite more people, and let's do this just as the PSG. Morocco plays with Hakimi, plays with Messi, and they all play on the same team. Thank you. Well, I will not speak about the World Cup until Sunday evening. Ramon, we have been speaking about Latin America, and you said we only speak to the Americans and to Europeans, and to go to the south you need to first go through the north. How can we change this? Do you think that maybe Brazil has the most advanced relationships with Africa after the Abayato scandal, the corruption scandal? Bolsonaro was never interested in Africa, basically. They probably until the new government from Lula will start moving, things will not change very much. I think we should be natural brothers with the Africans, but it seems that we never get too close to them. Well, there are several things we can do, but there is one in particular that we are doing, and that's this type of events and the role played by Morocco. I would like to call out this dear country to re-establish flights with Brazil. I have attended this fora 4 times, and before it used to take me half the time. Now I need to fly to Madrid to come down to Marrakesh. Before, I used to take a flight from Brazil direct to Morocco. That was a flight that was on every single day. After COVID, this disappeared. It was interrupted, and we need that link with Morocco, which is the entry point into Africa, and that brings together 3 powers: South America, or Hispanic America, because the South does not start at the Ecuador, but rather more just down from Mexico. And Morocco is just there. It's in the key place for international ties, flights, ships, etc. It is therefore very important to keep this forum alive and to re-establish communications. These talks may actually translate into business activities, and we are improving our geographic space. Jamil mentioned the Chinese question. They are not Catholic, they are a different race, and they have come out of the blue. But China, after Mao's death, had witnessed a turning point in their economy. And therefore, they are now making progress, getting very close to the world's #1 power. I am interested in agreements with China, agreements between China and my country, my region, but I am also interested in public moral, in transparency, to be at the top. Corruption should not be an element for the distortion of, for the appearances of governments, just the ones we've seen in Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba. So these sort of things need to be done in these fora. We need to start resolving these issues. Our continent, the South Cone, Mercosur, Bolivia, Paraguay, Uruguay, Brazil, and Argentina, 5 countries. Bolivia was a member, an associate member. And what happens is that we make a huge amount of food. Bolivia has 3 different crops every year around Santa Cruz. Argentina, the state, I didn't mention this, the state takes 66% of the value of the production in municipal, provincial tax, and then another trick they do when it comes to charging and around the conversion rate. Anyway, but they still produce the same. Today, Brazil is producing increasingly more, and they have the problem of this certain ecology fanatism around the Amazon. I think ecology can be defended also through economic success. So you cannot say that you cannot touch any trees while you see that your population is starving. So there is always a middle way solution to do both things and to protect all interests. In the case of Argentina, we need to find a way out to the economic issues, and demagogy cannot be the solution. You cannot have 6 million people paying tax and then 16 million people not paying any tax. So this is the lies from a government that is still in power based on these lies and on the corruption. This is a great difficulty. In our particular case, this is remarkable. And other neighboring countries have to face very similar issues. So, again, in short, a lot to do. But I am happy that we are meeting up here to do something that hadn't happened for 3 years. The last time we met in person was back in 2019. And again, let me highlight the role of Morocco and of the organizers of this event. So I would like to thank them for their kind invitation. But there are other initiatives. Argentina has just opened a plant of a sweet-making plant in Angola.
Funky Atlantic Dialogues app. It was called the World Cloud. In one word, how do you see the future of Africa-Latin America relations? If we can put the words on the screen, please. They should pop.
Wake up, everybody.
I don't want to stick to uncertain, but it seems like quite the hit. Imperative. Panelists, what do you think? What could define Africa-Latin America relations? Jamil?
I like the combination of promising and uncertain.
Tuto?
No, they're all good. I'll take one. The youth in particular, because in English, because ¿está bien? I speak Texan, which resembles English. But youth, I'll say this about youth. The world has changed so much that today's youth is more interconnected across regions, continents than we have ever been. I grew up without TV, and now I can talk to anybody, anywhere, and the youth are used to that, and they have developed networks and relationships that we can only dream of in terms of how they're being used. So I am very glad that you're doing this emerging young leaders program here, because I guarantee you the young people have more in common than any other generation before that. And I don't want to delve into the technical details, but there is a revolution in the digital world that's coming that is going to make the previous ones pale by comparison. Web3, a decentralized digital world where content creators own their content. I'm not talking about crypto. I'm talking about the decentralized blockchain, where it's not a big US or Chinese platform that owns the data, but rather be very decentralized. It's going to change everything, including democracy. I predict that we will be soon voting on blockchain one day, pretty soon, and more trustworthy and more credible than the paper ballots and everything else we do. But in the youth, I think the potential to interconnect youth that have more in common with today's digital technology is very huge, and in Latin America we have great potential. I've worked with the digital platform, and I was surprised that when it comes to text and content, Latin America, we're pretty weak in terms of content generation. In videos, we are very good. We have Messi, we have Neymar, we have Shakira, we have Maluma, we have, trust me, and their talents travel to Japan, to Thailand, to Nigeria, everywhere else. So the potential to link up cultures, regions, countries in the decentralized digital world is huge. And trust me, everybody now knows Bono, Hakimi, En-Nesyri, what's the name? The Michael Jordan of Morocco, the one that jumped 5 meters and scored. Everybody knows him now, and you know Messi, so there's great potential, and keep the youth involved, because they will be interconnected in a way that our generation never was.
Ramón, ¿cuál?
Qué duda. Varias de ellas.
La que más te guste.
Just pick the one you like. Well, it's actually a combination. I would rather leave it there. Shall we just say that it is actually a mixture, a cocktail of things, and then quickly I would like to talk again about the youth. And this is something that we were going to refer to because there is a new left-wing pantheon in Latin America for several reasons. And in these last days at the Atlantic Dialogues, well, yesterday there was a panel on street power. We have protests in Sudan. I covered these last year in Lebanon, in Iraq, in Chile, in Ecuador. We will see what happens in Peru very shortly. And a large part of these have been led by the youth, who are very dissatisfied. What are the factors that have led to this consequence, and what has been achieved, what has not? The protests sometimes lead to a new constitution. For example, in Ecuador, in Colombia, they actually led to the rising of Gustavo Prieto. That's the first time a left-wing president took the power in the country. Jamil, you referred to the protests back then. What are the protests today like? And what are they pursuing? The first thing I would like is to think that this is still my time. And then secondly, well, you're still young. Yes, and then secondly, I would like to refer to quote Ortega y Gasset. I am myself and my circumstances. We cannot analyze anything unless we take into account the context. As Tuto was saying, Social media today is a world that is already there, and it wouldn't make any sense to criticize it or to speak wonders about it. It is the reality that we have to take into account, full stop. And then how have things changed? Well, how did we communicate before? We had the standard and classical media. The news were already prejudged by an editing team who used to give us the news as they wanted us to read them. Today, anyone can write anything, and this gives us the capacity to analyze those news. Secondly, this is massive, is immediate, is never-ending. It doesn't stop. It is attractive, appealing. We have a much more direct democracy these days. However, democracy entails three things. It entails democracy at the core, at the origin of the power, with a process of election, legitimacy of origin. It actually entails legitimacy in the exercise of the actual politics, but also, and this is something that we often forget about, it actually entails legitimacy of the results. It is the people's will through an election process, by the people and for the people. In a very ironic comment from Joseph Stiglitz, who said that the problem in the US is that this, Lincoln's formulation, everything for the people, by the people and for the people, has become something by 1% for 1%. So very few things are as revealing as perceiving inequality and injustice. Injustice when it comes to corruption, as Ramon mentioned. Inequalities also. In the US, they consider that 1% of the population have 35% of the gross domestic product. But in China, the figures say that 1% of the population have 30% of the GDP, and this is a communist country. So sometimes the names, the labels or the tags may get us confused. What's left-wing, what's right-wing, and what I think we have today is a great insatisfaction. People do not like what they have, what they see. Any inspiration and aspiration has become a right, and I feel that because I want something, I am entitled to demand that thing. We are accustomed to having everything we ask for. And in 18 consecutive election processes in Latin America, those who are in power would lose those elections, because when the people are not happy, what do? They look up to protest, and up there is where there is the incumbent government. So I think there is upsetting feeling, the policies based on identity that tend to believe that everyone has the right to demand certain things. We think that because we have constitutions, we are entitled to receiving all those things. This is negative. However, in closing, we also say that there is a current or a wave. Let's just call it a pink wave. But what happens with waves? Well, waves come and go. Waves do not have are not permanent usually. They're just flowing, except when it comes to everybody's vote. When this is changed to one vote, one person, one time. What happens with those people who get to the power and they actually do not want to give up power ever again? We have heard the examples, no doubt. We're talking about Venezuela, Nicaragua, Cuba, and there are 2 or 3 other countries that are tempted to follow suit, and we're hopeful that they will not achieve it. Tuto, very quickly. Yes, quickly. Street protests in democracy should be channeled, should be listened to, and they should lead to positive changes. This is what we all want. In Chile, we heard that. I am not sure that the protests actually did get to the assembly, but there were a series of changes. The constitution was finally not approved. Now they are making other efforts with that aim, But listening to the street is always necessary. My concern is that this happens in Chile, this happens in Colombia. We will see how the Peruvian story ends, and this happens in Brazil. But in Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba, this is not the case. Protests are stopped violently over there. I was in Venezuela twice. I was declared a non-wanted person in the country twice. In 2017, there was a savage repression with more than 250 people dead. Again, in Nicaragua, we had problems and violence in 2018, repressions, including lots of killings in Nicaragua, all the protests in Cuba last year. This is the concern, and I believe that this momentum is so important. My concern beyond these three countries is that Mr. Chavez had a model that he wanted to export, and he never had what we do see every day, influence and the aid of the G4, Mexico, Argentina, Colombia, and Brazil. Hugo Chavez, no matter how much money he had, he never actually managed to control the G4. Today, due to reasons which are difficult to understand, all four, the big four countries are letting what Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua are doing. With the Estrada doctrine, they say, well, I am your friend, and they get stabbed behind their backs. They say that they will not get involved in national policies, and they do. So one would come to expect from new leaders, such as López Obrador or Lula, to defend the principles that allowed them to achieve their office. Because the street protest has to be listened to, it has to be responded, but there are three dictatorships, three verging on the criminal, which are not reacting to this. And Martin Luther King used to say, free at last, and again, Cuba libre, free Cuba and free Nicaragua. I hope that that will become a reality one day. Tuto has just mentioned something that I was going to say myself. I was counting the governments that have fallen, and also the uprisings in our countries. In these three countries that he mentioned, the violence was really such an atrocity. And here the requests are totally different. They are calling for freedom. Freedom that we do have and that we shouldn't lose. Therefore, reinforcing political party is absolutely fundamental. Choosing a president on the basis of your attitude is very difficult. We cannot ask anyone, just anyone, to lead a whole country. I can tell you some of the things that went wrong when I was a president, so you can avoid it. And the media, the mediatic profile, actually sends the message that because something is new, will not be successful. And it all boils down to reflecting on these issues and finding new solutions. And the solution doesn't necessarily have to be a new constitution. The best constitution is the one that does not change. In my country, we approved re-elections. And corruption went up like never before, because the people in the power thought that they needed to do everything possible to get as much money as possible, as far as they could. Anyway, the environment of these figures is also important. So, again, I believe the first system is the one based on on one amendment for each election period. And what happens in Chile is rather sad. They will not manage to change something in an environment that has a lot of ideology involved. You can do this when there is freedom, but you cannot destroy the ABC of any system, which is democracy and the Constitution.
Questions. Please remember, it's a question and not a speech. And identify yourselves. The lady right here in the purple shirt, please.
Hola.
Hello, good afternoon. I'm from Argentina, Mrs. Belisario. During your expose, you brought to the fore a lot of things that have not been working. North-North cooperation, South-South cooperation haven't been working. A lot of things happening in our continent that have been working. I'm a young leader. I'd like to see change in my country. I'd like to get your ideas about the future, hopeful ideas. And also I'd like to know what we as a continent can offer the world. What can the world learn from Latin America? Thank you very much. There isn't a lot that Argentina can teach the world. It's true that the Mercosur-EU agreement was very interesting. We now have a region in the world that has been war-free for 80 years. We have us making recommendations to the rest of the world is not that easy. I insisted a lot on democracy and the importance of political parties. I don't want to repeat myself, but that's what's needed. I mentioned that the four major Latin American countries look the other way when democracy is destroyed, especially under the three tyrants that exist. I'm from Bolivia. Yeah, I know that independence comes from the north, from Simón de Bolívar, and that the sun rises in the east. And I'm sure that the defense of democracy comes from the south. It comes from Argentina. Help us to do this.
Professor from Brazil, and I would like to make a very short comment and a question. We're used to saying that Latin America's problems are fundamentally economic, but the reality of the region increasingly shows that this may be a simplistic interpretation. We have important movements happening in several countries that involve religion, ideology, and social resentment related to the political elites, including Brazil. How to strengthen institutions and to combat the emergency of radicalism in our countries. I would like to hear you about that. Thank you.
Any takers? Jamil?
Los tiempos de reacción se van.
I think that reaction times are becoming shorter. I never would have thought that governments governments that took a lot of time to build and get to power, such as the one in Chile, would have lost so much popularity in such little time. They've only been in power for a very short period of time, and they're losing popularity. I think radicalization is understandable. Tuto just pointed to that. We had good protests in the street is always helpful to democracy, and democracy has mechanisms to integrate these protests, to improve the system through these protests. I think that if the situation becomes worse, we're talking about the economy, of course, but we also have to look at the social aspects. Economy affects everybody's lives. Juan Pedro and Maria. If the economy continues to deteriorate, that idea that we're not in the best of systems is also going to grow. Well, there are people going to say, well, you're talking about the system. What does the system have for me? What am I going to get out of the system? Because if the system doesn't give me anything or what I aspire to, why should I defend the system? I defend what is useful to me. I believe that form follows function. If something functions, people will integrate it, will defend it, will want to use it. But if it doesn't function, even though we like the concept, it has no future. So radicalism, yes, there has to be a space for them. They have the right. People have the right to express themselves. Let's hope they don't become the majority. And let's hope that we find ways of being able to serve the majority of our population. The part that doesn't feel well. Support to democracy in Latin America has been very low in Latin America. It's not that people want dictatorships, but they want a dictatorship with other things. So democracy with this and democracy with that. A democracy followed by other things. I don't think that we are suffering from democracy fatigue. No, we are, in fact, suffering from a situation that is a result because we are not democratic. I think that we want real democracy that has to go beyond elections, a democracy that takes into account people's living conditions. In some of my classes, I asked the following question. If you have a country, let's think of Mr. Clinton in the US, an elected president, he governed under the Constitution, and the economy was doing very well. So, A+ on all fronts. Let's go to another situation. Let's say we're in paradise. Let's say you can't have those three things. You have to sacrifice one of them. Which would you sacrifice? In one of my classes, there was just utter silence because we were saying, how could you criticize elections or the rule of law? But in general, North American students and European students would never get rid of the first or the second, in my interpretation, because the difference between governments is very little. You know, this elected government or that elected government, they're not very different. They're pretty much on the same path. In Latin America and in the developing world, they would never sacrifice the third element. For everyone wants well-being for their family. Everybody wants things to function for everybody. And then I could sort of like not really pay so much attention to the first two. This is why we have so many authoritarian regimes. And when China started buying commodities, we had very authoritarian governments that could provide subsidies for programs. And to date, that there is a large part of our population that continues to support that kind of system. I'm from Mexico. I'm part of the Emerging Leaders Group. Technological transformation within the government. We see this as something that can help governments with austerity programs and with corruption. I went from the public sphere to the private sphere because in the government there was a lot of sexual harassment, a lack of clarity with my professional evolution. So there are a lot of young people who don't want to be in politics. What can we do to make this situation more healthy so that young people and women work for the government, want to part of government, part of the public sector? I know that it's very frustrating, as Jamil was saying. Politics has become a dirty adjective. And we forget what politics means, what its etymology is, and that is it's building cities. You should spend part of your life working with your community, contributing to it. Because if you don't, we will only have the thieves participating in the politicos. I've suffered a lot, from my political life, but I would not do things differently. I think that those of us who are educated, who've had experience, should spend part of our lives as serving the public sector. Whereas not all of it, but part of it. And one quick comment with respect to Fernanda from Brazil was saying, Brazil has a free press, independent institutions, free press is useful. One macro comment, and with that I conclude, it was very hurtful to see the waste, because for the first time the region is seen as governable apart. I mean, we had a hard time being accepted in major forum. Now we're invented to G7, major summits. Now we have 3 seats of the 20 available. And unfortunately, Mr. López Obrador doesn't go. Bolsonaro doesn't go. I don't know, like what happened with Lula, etc. But what I hope is now that we have 3 seats of the 20, where we're talking about climate change, China, labor conditions, etc. Everything that we've talked about, the decisions are made in that forum. It's so sad that we haven't used this because of this position, very inward-looking position taken by the Mexican president and by the Brazilian former president. And if you don't want to use these spaces, if you don't want to use these seats in these spaces, lend it to us. We want to go there.
By one of my heroines, Zainab Badawi. Thank you very much, everyone.
Ladies.